Today is September 8th, 2022, and allow me to welcome you to our weekly podcast, or as weekly as we can make it. It's the Chapter 49 podcast. We welcome you. Glad that you chose to join us today. Whether you're watching us on video or listening to the audio podcast, either way, we appreciate the fact that you've taken a little bit of your time to listen to what we have to say today. My name is Larry Lannan. I am a volunteer with Chapter 49 dealing with communications. We at Chapter 49 represent most IRS employees in the state of Indiana. Welcome to our chapter president, Duncan Giles, who has been on every single podcast we have ever produced. Welcome back.
That's a scary thought, isn't it, Larry? We've both been here.
We've both been here for every podcast, and I just wonder, how do we do it?
Some people wonder why we do it, but that's a whole different discussion.
And they still listen and they still watch, and that is still a mystery to me, but we're glad to have them. And what we try to do here is talk about issues that relate to people who work for the Internal Revenue Service or people who work for the federal government, particularly IRS employees in the state of Indiana, but we have been surprised at the number of people who like to watch and listen outside the state of Indiana. So we like to take that into consideration as well. So always good to talk to you, Duncan, as fall has fallen and we are in the fall season now. We know it's fall because college football has already started. And we also, of course, have the NFL, which is starting literally on the day we record this. It's the Thursday night game that kicks off the NFL season. So with that, it's always the season to talk about major issues, and it's always this time of year that the pay raise issue begins to foment. And we've been talking about it for several months. We've spoken about it, about what the National Union has been pushing a 5.1% average raise. Most of the proposals through Congress, 4.6%. The president has now officially stated he wants 4.6%. Is it a done deal, Duncan, or where are we on this whole pay raise issue?
Well, as it is with our with our government, it's not a done deal until the ink is dried on the signatures. Right now, the way it's looking is the both the House and the Senate have been basically silent on the pay raise. And the president, as been predicted, has proposed a 4.1% pay raise with a 0.5% locality pay. So some people will get, a little bit more than 4.1. Some people in higher areas where its cost of living is very high will get a greater one. But yeah, overall, it looks like 4.6. National NTU has been pushing very hard. And I urge everybody to reach out to your congressperson or your senators. They've been asking for 4.1% with a 1% locality pay. So we're trying to get more money because we realize inflation is out there and we want to make sure that we're trying to get the most that we can to keep that at bay. But it's going to take all of our voices to even get that entertained. So there's still time to talk to your congressperson or your senator about this. You can go in on your own time and on Not on Government Computer to NTU. They have very easy emails that you can send, and those are counted. Those are looked at and those are listened to by the congressional offices. So I would urge everyone who's watching or listening to do that and have your family do that just to get a shot at a greater raise.
Right. So I think that what we need to keep in mind here, and what I think we need to mention it, because a lot of people working at a place like IRS, we're very process oriented. So what we are seeing now is the proposals in Congress, and the president is recommending 4.6% with the 5.5% to locality, 4.1 general, and locality goes out depending on the cost of living, not the cost of living, but the cost. It's actually tied to the cost of labor. We've talked about this in the past, but it's based on your locality, not and a lot of people geographically are in the rest of the U.S. They get a pretty low one. In Indiana, the Indianapolis metro area has a different locality, and the Chicago area, where our Merrillville office is located, has a different locality. but the rest of the U.S. for the most part. And this varies all around the country depending on where you work. Where is your post of duty? And that's what determines your locality pay. So right now, the Congress has not acted on the pay raise. And that's why we say it is not a done deal yet. As Duncan said, the ink isn't dry. The ink hasn't even been placed on the paper yet. So at this point, we do need to let you know there's still time to let your elected officials know how you feel about this, and having your friends and family kick in is also a very good idea. So we wanted to start off with that. Pocketbook issues are obviously extremely important to everyone. But I want to talk also about something we've been discussing for several weeks. And 2 weeks ago, we discussed this with our national president, Tony Reardon. And there's still an awful lot of awful noise everywhere about the IRS budget and this Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to fund the IRS with extra money over the next 10 years. People are talking about what is this going to mean? I mean, Tony Reardon was clear, no, we're not going to have 87,000 gun toting people aiming their guns at small business people and individuals. No, that is not what the bill is going to do. It's mostly going to replace people planning on retiring in the next 10 years based on IRS projections. And we'll add some staff. Most of them will just be collection officers and people who do audits, individual all the way up to big corporations. And there will be an emphasis on the larger businesses in this. So, you know, the idea that the IRS is becoming this huge bloated bureaucracy it just doesn't take into consideration the natural attrition and the projected attrition of IRS staff. So when you continue to see this, and sadly, it's even some elected officials who are spouting some of this misinformation. It does make you feel bad, but you just have to call it out when you see it and try to get the record straight.
And I think that's exactly it, Larry, because I've had discussions with people, and they spout the line about the 86,000. I'm like, you couldn't be further from the truth. Most of it is going to be replacement hiring. It's going to take people a few years to get going, and these are people who are going after people who are not doing the right thing. If you're doing the right thing tax wise, we want to have more people who are on the phones to help you, in taxpayer advocate to be able to assist you if the system has a hiccup or breaks down, and go after those people who are not doing their taxes right or hiding income. Or once they do owe and they can't or won't figure out a pay plan or something of that nature, that we have the people to go out and collect it so we can A, get the fair share of taxes, and B, beat down the tax gap. But this whole thing about the jackbooted agents and the gun toters and all that is just malarkey. Since I'll keep this a PG rated podcast, and I won't say what I want to say.
You're stealing a line from the president. You realize?
I know. That's just the word that came to me at the time. It's just absolutely asinine. And the people who are spouting this, the politicians who are spouting this, absolutely know it's not true, but they're playing to the lowest base that they have, and it's just I would say it's a shame, but it's not a shame. It's a tragedy, and it's absolutely abysmally wrong.
Yeah, and Tony Reardon made this point on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, that in the last 10, 20 years, IRS has lost 20% of its staff. And how can an organization, any organization this large, continue to function well with 20% less staff, and not just the same workload, but a bigger workload with all these tax law changes and other burdens that are put on the service? Service is not afraid to take on the burden. Just give us a fighting chance to have the budget to take care of it. I think that's all the service has ever asked for. So again, we just would encourage people, set the record straight if you hear something that just seems wrong. We are not being, I saw one public former elected official put on Twitter that the IRS will now become the largest bureaucracy in government. Well, that's true if nobody ever quit or retired. Well,
Yeah.
people do quit, and a lot of them are definitely going to retire just based on the IRS's own projections. So we need to take all that into consideration. So we're hoping this tamps down, but we're in an election year, so these things are going to happen. We just have to set the record straight as best we can as people who work at the agency, and of course, NTU as a union is going to continue to do that. I hope what we just talked about has not added to the mental stress that IRS employees are feeling. There's enough mental stress just doing this job, dealing with a public that is frustrated. I mean, we've all been dealing with COVID for a couple of years and really just beginning to come out of that. And sometimes there's a delayed impact when you've had all these stresses for almost a 2-year period, or maybe more than a 2-year period for some. I think, Duncan, you would like to remind people that there is help if you're feeling mental or emotional stress as you try to do your job.
Absolutely, Larry. Stands on to everything else. If you're out there on the phones or a taxpayer advocate or a revenue officer, revenue agent in the service centers, wherever you are, you're being asked to do more and more and more with less resources, as we've just talked about. And the Employee Assistance Program, EAP, is a great way to get some counseling if you need help. I'm a huge, huge believer. You want to take care of not just your physical health, but your mental health as well. My awesome daughter is a mental health professional, and she would highly recommend that, if you have an issue, if you're feeling stressed, if you need somebody to talk to, do it. There's no shame in it. It's just like having a cut on your arm or something like that. You get that taken care of. This is something you need to get taken care of. So don't think that you have to absorb everything. Don't think that you have no outlet, or there's nobody to talk to, or there's nothing that can help for this. Reach out to the EAP program. They can set you up with counselors, get you started, with a couple of free sessions. Then, if you've got the FEHP programs, many of those will pay so that you can have a reduced rate for counseling sessions, and they truly can help you. And that's what I just want for everyone, is to be, like you said, the job's stressful enough. Anything we can do to alleviate that, we need to try and do.
So remember, EAP is a program for you. And if you feel the need to use it, use it. I believe, is it still 4 free sessions at the beginning? Is that the way it
Yes.
works? And then you can check your health insurance if you need more. And that can help defray the bill if you wish to continue to see that professional again. So we've harped on this in the past. We say it again: a mental or emotional issue is just as impactful as if, as Duncan said, you cut your arm or you break your leg or you have a heart attack. People know that has to be treated. Well, guess what? Mental health, emotional health issues also need to be treated. And if you don't treat it, it can get worse. So please don't be afraid to use the tools that the agency has allowed for you. Speaking of tools, there is a deadline coming up. You and I have talked for a long time about the child care subsidy. We talked to Tony Reardon about this a couple of weeks ago. You were a part of the bargaining team that negotiated that in the national agreement. But and we're recording this on the 8th of September. There is a deadline coming up. So talk about that.
Yeah, we've got a very short deadline coming up, about a week, that you can apply to this program. So if you do qualify, if your total family income is below 70,000, or in some cases 80 or even 90,000, you have child care that you're paying for outside of the home, absolutely look into this, because this can get you money back in your pocket. They've finally got a vendor that's ready to take this on. They will be dealing directly with, to get you reimbursements. And it's a great, great program. We're hoping it's going to be run right. And so far, the initial signs are good. But we want to make sure that everybody knows it's out there. I don't want to hear anybody say, "Oh man, I missed it. I could have used that money," because we want you to be able to get that reimbursement. So please, if you think you may qualify, by all means, go ahead and put in for this. This program's there for you. It's money set aside for you to help you through this.
And this again, you never know when people are going to watch or listen to a podcast. So hopefully, if you're eligible, you're watching or listening before the 14th of September. But another thing you have mentioned before is that this is retroactive to the first of the year. So hopefully you've kept receipts or you can get copies of them so that once you have signed up, you can begin to get your reimbursements going back as far as the 1st of January, 2022.
Yeah, that was something NTU pushed very, very hard for, because this program was supposed to be starting right as the time of the new contract is, around the 1st of October, and it didn't get started. So we pushed very hard and got it retroactive to the 1st of January. So absolutely, like you said, go back to your, if you don't have it, go back to your child care provider, ask for copies of the receipts or something of that nature, so you can get reimbursed for that.
Well, and so just take note of that if it's something you can use, or if you know someone else in the service who might be eligible for this. It's mostly for parents who are of low income, or a single parent particularly could take advantage of this. Let's move on. And with all this money the IRS will soon be getting with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a letter that was penned by a number of members of Congress. I can't remember how many, but several of them, basically saying, "Hey, IRS, you're not hiring customer service representatives fast enough. People still can't get through to you or get in to see you." So I think part of it is that the service is not getting as many applications as they had hoped. But what Congress is saying is, you've got to go out and recruit, just like the private sector is, and some other government agencies are doing. So, are you seeing any positive signs in that regard?
I haven't strangled anybody yet, so I consider that a positive sign. One of the problems, and I mentioned this at our bargaining table over a year ago, is the way that we hire folks on our phone, our CSRs, is as seasonals. They come in as seasonals, which I could understand 15, 20 years ago, because the work was seasonal. Well, now this work is year round. People are calling all year round. So we need to hire these folks as permanents to start with. I think that would greatly increase the number of applicants we're getting, so that we could hire more people and have, a better level of service than the abysmal level that we have now. But, until then, I'm not sure what's going to happen. We need to go back out. As was pointed out to me, earlier this week, we used to go out to, different expos, fairs, things of that nature, have booths, talking to people. It doesn't seem like we do that as much anymore. And that's partially because we don't have the people to do it as much anymore. It's again, a contraction of the agency that hurts us in so many different ways. And so we've got to get back to these, boots on the ground type of thing. We've got to get out, talk to people, meet people, get them interested, tell them why it's a good process, aside from, some of the people who are out there saying, don't go into this, don't go into the IRS, we're going to take care of them. I would disregard that at this point. It can be a very rewarding career, as you and I both know. And, we just need to get more people on there. So we're not in disagreement at all with those folks from Congress who are penning the letter. We would love to hire more, and they are trying their best, but right now it's still an uphill battle.
I received at least one contact after I retired asking if I would like to come back to the service and be an instructor. And I had to politely say no. My IRS career is over. But I would think, for example, what you just talked about, why couldn't the service, if there aren't enough people to go to these expos and some of these places where we have had booths to recruit people, why can't we get retirees to go in there and do that? I think the service needs to think creatively about this. And, we don't want to take people off their job to do this, because we desperately need them on their
Right.
regular job. But on the other hand, there are probably some creative ways to do that. So I'm hoping that NTE will urge, and that the IRS management will look at something like, look creatively at trying to find ways to do the recruiting outreaches that I know the service did for years while I was there.
Yeah, and NTU National, and I can tell vouch for myself personally, have talked to the higher ups in the IRS extensively about this type of thing and having to think outside the box to try and get more people to be competitive.
Well, there's something else we talk about almost every podcast, or at least every few podcasts. We keep hoping that for people who are retiring, that this backlog at the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, they're the final arbiter of your retirement. You get the retirement paperwork into your agency, they check it over. Then, when they think it's in good shape, send it off to OPM, and OPM has to make the final determination on this. There's been a huge backlog at OPM. There was a pretty big backlog when I retired, but it looks nice compared to what it is today. And it's because OPM has had trouble recruiting and retaining employees as well, just like the IRS and other government agencies. So they're doing the best they can with the people they have. But NTU just recently came out with a message of the last week, warning these people who are retiring, hey, this backlog is not improving. So I think this goes back to something you have said on several of our podcasts. If you want to retire, fine, but you need to plan ahead and make sure you have enough money for that lower monthly payment you're going to get from your retirement until that final retirement figure is verified by the OPM.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And like you said, they're doing the best they can. This is not OPM dragging their feet at all. It's just trying to, you know, suck thousands of gallons of water through a garden hose. It's just, you don't have the ability to do that. You can only take in so much. So they're trying, but until they get staffed up, until they're able to do things properly, we're going to have this because it is a very paper detailed process. Unfortunately, still, it's not something that is, really goes well with technology, computers, things of that nature. There's still a lot that has to be checked via paper. So, it's just a shame, but those numbers are not going down. They're not leaping up, but they're not going down like you would think this time of year they would before the end of the year crush. So if you are, like I've said before, if you are planning on retiring, get your paperwork in as soon as possible with the furthest out date that you're going to retire. Let them have the time to do it. Otherwise, as you said, Larry, they're going to be looking at very short checks for quite a long while.
Yeah, and I had to plan ahead for that myself. So it is something you need to consider. So again, we say the same thing if you're retiring plan. I know that a lot of people who are considering retirement watch or listen to this podcast. Something else we want to talk about, we fortunately aren't having to talk about COVID as much. And when we started this podcast 2.5 years ago, that was all we talked about for
Yeah.
a long time, lead story on every podcast. So isn't it nice that we can put it kind of later on in the podcast? But there is something that has come up lately that NTU has been working on. This Safer Workforce group in the White House has come out with guidelines on what an agency must do when you have an outbreak of COVID in your local area. And what that guideline basically says is number one, you can make masks required in that workplace. And secondly, the mask has to be of a certain high quality, N95, and there's some others. I won't get into all that, but there's a certain minimum quality standard that must be used when you're in that workplace. When NTEU saw that, they went back to the Safer Workforce group and said, well, wait a minute, these can be very expensive and difficult to find. How do you expect these employees to go out and get these masks? Don't you think the agencies should be responsible for the cost and acquisition of this? And to their credit, the Safer Workforce group agreed with NTEU and updated their standards. So do we have any workplaces in Indiana where there is a mask requirement right now?
Absolutely, we do, and it changes every week. Um, and I get it from the post of duties, which ones are going from low to medium or medium to high or high to medium, and it does change quite a bit. But there are some, and I know for our folks who listen outside of Indiana, it runs the gamut. So the fact that NTU is is making sure that the agencies are doing things properly and saying, hey, look, you want folks to wear masks, the safer workforce wants them to wear masks, you need to supply them in the workforce. And I know our facilities folks have been doing pretty well, at least from what I've been able to see and tell, on making sure they're on top of that.
So if you are working in a post of duty where there is a mask requirement, you should be asking the management how they're going to get the mask to you. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
One last thing, as far as items on the agenda to discuss in this podcast, and man, this is an annual ritual, is it not, Duncan? It's September, and what happens at the end of September? The fiscal year ends. So, of course, it's the job of the Congress and the president, mostly the Congress, to pass a budget for the coming fiscal year. I cannot remember in my federal career how many years that budget was done on time, but it's not very many. Usually there's a continuing resolution that just holds over the previous year's budget, which is essentially a cut when you have inflation like this, particularly. And so government funding runs out at the end of this month. Congress is supposed to pass a continuing resolution. There's a lot of drama already starting with getting that continuing resolution passed in the Senate and the House for the president's signature. Where nobody is forecasting a government shutdown at this point, and we hope that continues to be the case. But there is at least some uncertainty over this, is there not?
There absolutely is, and there always seems to be uncertainty over this. You're absolutely right. It would be so nice to say, hey, you know what? We've passed the budget bills. We've done our work. We've done what we're supposed to do and gotten it to the president. Well, that hasn't happened, like you said, in quite a long time. So at this point, at the end of the month, yep, we run out of money. Now, as you said, it doesn't look like a shutdown. We've had other years, though, where it hasn't looked like a shutdown, and all of a sudden the train decides to go running off the tracks at about 100 miles an hour. We hope that calmer heads will prevail. This being an election year, I don't think it'd be very popular for anybody if the government shut down at all, much less any length of time. So we're hoping that they will pass a continuing resolution. I know there's discussions already about it, some favorable, some not, as you pointed out. But we need to get this done, and we need to get it done fairly quickly because Congress is not going to be in session that much longer.
And if you want updates, you'll find them here on this podcast. We try to keep that weekly. Plus, we have a Facebook page, NTEU Chapter 49 Indiana. If you have trouble finding it, send an email to Duncan Giles, and he will be more than happy to give you a link as to how to get to that Facebook page. We do updates on that at a fairly regular basis. And that email address is nteu49 at AOL.com. You can also get on a list where Duncan will alert you when we have our video and audio podcast up and running, and you'll have a link to either one or both. Why you'd want to watch it, why you'd want to go to both, I don't know. One or the other, I think, would be plenty. We'd like you to join us, but I don't think you have to watch us and listen separately. I don't think that's necessary. With that in mind, Duncan Giles, your final comment for this podcast.
Yeah, I just, I want everybody to be safe out there with the increased vitriol that's going on. Don't advertise where you work. It's a sad state of affairs when it has to come to that, but there are people out there who are just, you see it every day in the news. They're attacking others for no apparent reason. You want to make sure that you and yours are safe. So, don't advertise where you work. Take your badge off when you're not at work, so it's not apparent to anybody. It's, set the record straight, let people know information, but don't get confrontational, don't get into fights. Just protect yourself. That's what I don't want to see anybody hurt over this.
Well, and I think Tony Reardon talked about this a couple of weeks ago that, he would like to see security just at the workplaces tightened up. and and make sure that people, when you walk into that federal building or IRS post of duty, whether it's rented space or a government building, that you have the proper security. And make sure, as you said, employees follow safety protocols. They're there for a reason, and we'd like to see them improved. And there is a security review going on. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, every time there has been a security review, IRS pours over data that it doesn't always look at every day. And boom, you get changes because people begin to see that data right in their face. So that's a very good comment. Please be safe and take all the precautions that Duncan just mentioned. And we are happy that you have joined us for this podcast. This is the Chapter 49 podcast. My name is Larry Lannan again, and Duncan Giles, our chapter president, is also with us for each podcast. We bring in a guest every now and then when we can. But right now, we are just happy that you have chosen to watch or listen to this podcast. I know we have fans on both different types of platforms. So Duncan and I have done this podcast for about 2.5 years now, and we've had a lot of feedback. I gave you the email address earlier in the podcast, NTEU49, chapter 4, NTE49 at AOL.com, NTU49 at AOL.com. If you have any comments or would like us to talk about any particular subject, let us know. In the meantime, please be safe and be kind.